Very good. Welcome back, everyone. So as I mentioned, now we're going to take a look at some other labor and employment issues, particularly on the wage and hour side. The creative title of this program is The Fast Pace of Your Service Causing Hidden Wage and Hour Issues to Lurk. And we've got two terrific thought leaders in this space to talk to you. And I want you to notice just how divergent their jurisdictions are when I introduce them. So first we have Emily Litzinger. Emily is a core member of the hospitality practice for the Fisher and Phillips law firm. And just so everybody is aware, Fisher and Phillips is an outstanding national law firm that represents employers. And I want to make sure you get to their website because the resources that they have developed for the general public as well as their clients are just extraordinary. So if you've never taken a meander through their website, I strongly encourage you to do it. But Emily works closely with restaurants and especially the Kentucky Restaurant Association there in her home base of Louisville. And so we're happy to have her back with us. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you so much.
And joining Emily is on the West Coast, Sacramento bound, is Mr. Alden Parker. Alden is the co-chair of the hospitality practice for Fisher Phillips. So we've got two dynamic thought leaders, two different perspectives from jurisdictional issues, state jurisdictions, of course. So we're anxious to hear more about it. But if you have not listened to their TED style talk, I strongly encourage you to do so because they went through some terrific information and some really details that you need to be aware of generally, and of course, if you're working in either one of their states. So to get us started, do you guys have a few comments or do you want me to jump right in with a question or two?
I'm happy to have you jump in with a question. The only thing I would add is that it is really interesting. You know, Emily and I were meeting on different topics today unrelated to this presentation, and this really has allowed a lot of interaction around the nation to allow a lot more perspectives. Just the speed of communications. Lawyers are not used to operating to the speed of fast casual or quick service restaurants, and this has forced us all to do that and really operate at the speed that everybody attending here is operating at. It's very fast. You get home, your feet are sore, and you're tired at the end of the day.
Yeah. So listen, before we get into the meat of y'all's presentation, and again, that's laid out in the TED Talk, but I do want to start out with a question around vaccines. We had a brief conversation earlier today about that, but given the two different jurisdictions you guys are in, we feel confident that we can insist that employees get a vaccine at the federal level with some exceptions, but is that holding true, Alden, out in California, or are we getting a different mindset out? And of course, what we're hearing is incentives are better, right? Encouragement is better than just you have to. But what are y'all's thoughts about that?
Yeah, Emily, you want to
jump in? I'll dig in. I have actually recently done a couple webinars on the topic, but I would say you're right. You're on the right path. As far as our firm has conducted a survey of about 700 employers, and the majority, I think it was like 63% say that they have no plans of mandating. And what we're seeing is that a lot of employers are focusing their efforts on some incentives, but there's also some loopholes there that you gotta kind of landmines that you gotta be aware of. But I think importantly, the lowest risk and a really good result is educating your workforce about the benefits of the vaccine and how it's going to make them safer. It's going to make the workplace safer. We're all going to go back to normal sooner. So that is like a fairly easy approach without a whole lot of risk. The deeper you get into all of that, there's more risk involved. Obviously, every situation, every employer, and every job duty is going to vary based on what are you doing, what industry are you in, how much contact you have with the public, and so on and so forth. So that's my perspective. Alden?
Yeah, I mean, Emily's exactly right. I'm going to share the screen real quick since we're jumping to this topic. I mean, we do have on our website the results of our flash survey. Fairly remarkable. I mean, there was 9% that were considering requiring employees. That's out of a pretty good sample size of 700.
Right.
Really, not many people are going ahead and going to a situation where they're requiring the vaccines. The EOC says you can, and it's a departure from what their normal stance would be, where they'd say it's a medical examination. So far, the most litigious state on the planet, California, hasn't come out with an opinion about whether they're permitted to go ahead and force or not. We think they'll stay silent for now on. But the interesting sort of tug of war that's going on here that I'm noticing with vaccines is there's very little incentive for the employer to go out on a limb and mandate these vaccines. The CDC guidelines, all these state guidelines about excluding employees for a certain amount of time if they're positive or if they've been in close contact, haven't incorporated the fact that do you have to exclude, for instance, a vaccinated employee if they came into close contact with an unvaccinated COVID positive person? Well, if an employer could say, I wouldn't have to exclude certain employees if I forced them to get a vaccine, I think more employers would rush to go ahead and be a little bit more aggressive in trying to get their employees to get vaccinated. But so far, the numbers are not good as far as the number of people that are voluntarily going to get vaccinated. And most employers are not going to force their employees to do it. The other troubling part is while the EEOC said you could go ahead and force people to get the vaccines, they also laid out what you could do to incentivize people to do it. And really, they came down on the idea that you can only go ahead and offer a nominal incentive. And the example that they gave is a water bottle. And that's just not going to motivate behavior the way that $500 would or $300 would. Yeah. Cash is king. It talks. And for whatever reason, the EEOC is looking at, well, the only thing an employer can do other than just say, you have to go get it, you will be fired if you don't get it, is to go ahead and offer some sort of nominal incentive for them to do it.
Emily, that's one of the loopholes you were talking about, right?
Right. I mean, I think what happens is you get a little more, you want to pay them $500 or you want to pay them extra PTO time. You get into the situations where you have individuals who otherwise are not able to be vaccinated. So it could be a disability, medical related issue, or it could be a religious, sincerely held belief, and they have a religious objection. So you have to, it gets a lot more complicated with that. The further you go, I mean, the risk increase, the more the incentive is, and you have to entangle yourself in more potential liability.
Oh man,
Stephen,
the yin and the yang.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting, in the industry we're talking about here, your quick service, your fast casual, we have a lot of young employees that are working, in our, in our industry, and for the most part, they are, if they're contracting it, their symptoms seem to be less severe. There's certainly outliers in that, but the group and the population of employees we're talking about do not perceive the risks as being great enough to motivate them to get out and get the vaccine. So someone contemplating a mandate is going to have to take into consideration the population of employees they have and what their reaction to that might be. I think it'd be fairly negative in this segment of the hospitality industry.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how it goes, and we'll just have to see what the future brings. But that's very helpful information. Thank you both. Let me shift gears from that now, and I just want to kind of see if we have a difference here. But what is the most frequent wage and hour claim out in California, Alden, that you typically face? And then Emily, I'm going to ask you the same thing in Kentucky.
Sure.
Yeah, and I'm happy to again share a screen here and just sort of put up what everybody probably saw on the TED Talk as what Emily and I think, as we were going ahead and developing this program, are pretty high on the list. you know, of this issue, I don't think we see anything more out here in California than meal and rest periods. It's in almost every complaint we get now, as either a tack-on claim to a harassment or discrimination case, or a standalone class action and PAGA case that everybody's bringing. There'll be other claims that become a part of that, where someone will say that their standardized bonuses didn't get calculated into their overtime correctly, or some other stuff. But it always leads with meal and rest. And that's where the bulk of the potential liability comes from. Most of the lawyers on the other side of the V for me that I talk to will routinely tell me that the number of calls that they get per week that start off as, you know, I just got terminated, I hate my employer, I had a really bad manager, she or he did this or that to me. They always steer the conversation to meal and rest and look for those issues, and they end up suing on meal and rest.
Yeah, that's interesting.
That is interesting. Now, and Alden, to be fair, meal and rest claims almost always have to be state claims, right?
Correct. But generally they're going to be state specific. So if you operate in states that have specific codes, labor codes or other codes in their system that provide for meal periods, there's a pretty high bar there. And so we work with our hospitality group by state in order to try and address those concerns. They're fairly complicated, unfortunately, and there's not a lot of uniformity. It's pretty amazing when you go up toward Shasta here in Northern California that, you know, within a half hour's drive, you're going across into Southern Oregon, and all of a sudden you've got a different level of meal period compliance that's awfully hard. So you could be an operator that does Klamath and Northern California and Southern Oregon and have two different systems of meal period compliance that are fairly complicated, that overlap in your one business and your one operation.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Emily, what about you? What's the most frequent?
I have seen a lot, and probably the last year, I've seen a lot of targeted Department of Labor and state labor cabinet enforcement for child labor law violations. It typically starts with that issue, and then it sort of unravels around unpaid overtime. So the hours worked are not properly calculated. And the last couple that I've worked with my QSR clients, it starts with one just they're not aware that there's different rules for 14 and 15 and 16 years old. And, it is fast paced and everything's going really quickly. And sometimes the managers aren't always trained on who's 15 and who's 17. And this person, it's a weekday or school's in session. And it's quite maddening when, for my clients, because they're just, a lot of them are just trying to keep these people employed and run a business. And unfortunately, they're getting dinged pretty hard with those types of violations. So I've done a lot of education with the Kentucky Restaurant Association, trying to make sure that people are aware of what the rules are and maybe some best practices about how to avoid those in the future.
And Emily, do you see those come up and touch on this menu that we have up on the screen? I mean, do you see that touching the minimum wage, the overtime, those types of issues?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, what it starts with, usually someone's complaining, a parent complains to, what it started here locally, it started with the Kentucky Labor Cabinet. And then I'm not sure how it's connected, but the Kentucky Labor Cabinet maybe communicate with the Department of Labor, and my poor clients are getting investigated by multiple agencies and dinged twice. So it's quite challenging. But it just takes some education and trying. I mean, ultimately, some of them have just decided not to employ minors under 15, so they're not 16, because it's just much more restrictive the younger you are.
Oh, I mean, for sure.
There'll be some local regulations on child labor that will tell them what equipment they can and can't work with in your QSR facility. So it's something very difficult when you're trying to arrange how the kitchen's going to operate, working around working around that one person or two people that you have in certain age categories.
For sure.
Yeah, the risk is pretty significant there. So the risk reward equation, I mean, we all want to put people to work, but that's a challenging, as Emily just pointed out, you almost need a spreadsheet to track all of that.
Well,
or a matrix. Yeah.
Right. We've even suggested like certain people wear certain colored shirts or hats.
Yeah.
So you can tell who's who, and just so the managers have some sort of idea what's going on.
Yeah. And Stephen, to your point, I mean, we've done charts for, multi-unit operators that are in different states, and so that they can have a chart for their managers that run through the common issues that they'll face, even down to final pay rules, overtime, whether there's a meal and rest compliance issue or child labor rules that apply there.
Right.
Do you guys ever see, since we're on this topic of, the different states and having to create charts, do you ever see, or has there been discussion of uniform state codes around some of these more meticulous wage and hour issues?
Here's my comment. So far, no, there hasn't been. It's really been a competition amongst the states. There is a worrisome trend with the new administration that I call the Californization of the federal rules, where we're exporting a great deal of people to the new administration's cabinet, to positions within the different agencies that deal with labor laws and with wage and hour laws. And these rules are likely coming to a national scale where the new floor will look a lot like California in terms of certainly overtime, minimum wage, tip credit are high on the list of things that have really differentiated states that may go away.
Right.
Yeah, that's good. Emily, in that regard, what are you hearing or seeing about the tip credit? Can you speculate a little bit about what you think is going to come down?
Yeah, so I guess the first thing is what's been in the news, and likely you're aware of what's going on, is this new Raise the Wage Act that's been proposed. That's an act that's going to increase the minimum wage from to $15 per hour by 2025. So in that, that's been proposed by the Democrats. It was originally passed through the House, and now with the unified Congress, it's a little more on everyone's radar. Now, recently this week, the Republicans are now pushing a bill that would only raise that to $10 per hour by 2025. So it seems like we're having a little bit of a battle. Nevertheless, the Raise the Wage Act that's been proposed with regard to the tip credit, it will not only raise that minimum wage, but it's going to throw that tip credit away. So a lot of restaurants are using that gratuities that a tipped employee gets to make it to that minimum wage, and it's completely undoing that. Another thing is, just like Alden mentioned, there are several other states that are following suit and have plans to increase the minimum wage to $15 per hour. So whatever it is, $10 or $15, it's definitely coming. It's in the pipeline. It's just where we end up, landing on.
And to be fair, I think our understanding is whichever passes, all of the suggestions are a phased in model to get to a certain level. Is that accurate?
That's correct. It's over the course, yes, of the next 4 years.
But your point just now about the tip credit wage phasing out, that could have a pretty significant, a significant impact on food operations.
The National Restaurant Association just released a survey, I think it was this week or last, that 90% of operators said that the passage of this legislation, this Raise the Wage Act, would negatively impact their ability to recover from the pandemic. So we're already facing some issues, brought a lot of issues with the shutdowns, but this is going to be challenging, and they're saying likely it's going to be reducing labor costs, increasing of automation, and then increase menu prices as well. So those are things that are probably going to happen if this type of legislation is passed.
Yeah. And Stephen, to your point, we saw a little microcosm of this in California, where the legislature, even under Democratic control, with the governor that was a Democratic governor, was not increasing the minimum wage out here. What that caused everybody to do is cities ended up passing their own minimum wage laws that were greater than the state. And once they got to a critical mass, the legislature felt that the solution, rather than this patchwork quilt of different approaches, was to raise across the board the minimum wage and then index the ultimate minimum wage you get to inflation.
Yep.
The proposals at the federal level now sort of mirror that, where enough states have gone ahead and acted like these California cities, creating these increased minimum wage burdens and different approaches to tip credit. That one of the selling points is that uniformity across the board now. It also looks like it has a lot of consequences of job loss. I mean, the estimated are 1.3 million jobs lost as a result of the minimum wage going up. But it does bring a uniformity from an application process that some people will see as positive depending on which states they're in. Those that are in high minimum wage states already are going to feel like, okay, well, that didn't impact as much.
Yeah.
Those tip credit states or total compensation states are going to really feel an impact of that minimum wage and the tip credit effect go.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's interesting. We had a program this morning on Canada, and they tie the minimum wage is tied to inflation. Very similar to what you were just describing, I think. And I think that's where we're headed. It's going to be interesting to see. But that removes the politicalization out, well, at least to an extent.
Well, it does, although, when you index it to a CPI, which California does, or you index it to inflation, if labor costs are continually rising, so too will a CPI. So too will inflation. And it'll be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So yes, you're committed to probably a never-ending situation of price or labor increases for the minimum wage, unless we just suffer pandemic after pandemic and keep shutting down the industry. The inflationary pressures on an increased minimum wage will continue. The other problematic part is every time the minimum wage goes up, so too does the salary threshold for exemptions. And so when we get to one of the issues that Emily spoke about in the TED Talk about misclassification, you see that effect a bit there as well. Emily, do you want to touch on that, what you've seen in the misclassification from that process?
Well, I see a lot of, and especially in the QSR industry, I see a lot of technical types of violations where I have operators who believe that maybe their assistant manager is an exempt employee and they're paying them exempt. And then when you really drill down and you look at actually what this person is doing from a day-to-day basis, on a regular basis, they're not meeting that job duties test, which the FLSA requires. So I have everything is very fact specific and it does change over time. So I'm always encouraging my restaurant clients to really look at the exemptions that they're relying on and do so on a regular basis to make sure that it's accurate, it's still accurate, because that's setting you up for some potential overtime, failure to pay overtime, and it can get very costly without you even kind of actively knowing that you're doing that wrong.
We had a rash of assistant manager class actions out here concentrating on just what Emily talked about, the duties test. We had way too many assistant managers that were hopping on the line in a QSR format and doing too much production work that took them over the threshold on a duties test. When this minimum wage issue came up, I encouraged everybody to look what the ladder does to the minimum salary test, because at the end, the minimum salary to pay someone to be an assistant manager or even a general manager of a location becomes really costly because you've got to essentially double the minimum wage on a set weekly salary. And, before you know it, in California, we're racing toward 15.
Right.
$15 a minimum wage. The minimum salary for an exemption is something like $62,000 or $64,000. And I had a lot of employees or clients years ago say, that's not worth it. I'm not going to pay someone that much, regardless of whether they meet the duties test. Everybody was judging that the work that they do isn't worth meeting that minimum salary test. So if the federal government goes the way of having this tiered approach, you're not just going to want to think about, is it worth it today to up the salary to whatever today's minimum wage is?
Right.
You're going to want to think about 3 years from now, is it worth it to pay that person? Or should I eliminate my classification risk now on the duties test by converting them to an hourly rate while it's lower?
Well,
That's
and
a strategy
ultimately,
decision.
yeah, I think ultimately too, I mean, the whole goal of all of that is to keep the labor costs down. So if, having this person at a salary and having them work a lot of hours is one thing, if that is really how it is in your workplace, but if it's something where they're not typically working overtime and that labor cost is not that much of a burden, I agree with you. It's something that you want to try to avoid because it might not be worth it.
Yeah.
Hey guys, I want to be mindful of our time. We just have a few minutes left, and I want to ask a question that we haven't addressed yet. And I'm not familiar with much in the way, if any, insurance that can be purchased to mitigate the risk or to provide coverage for wage and hour type claims. Have you guys run across anything like that?
No, I haven't. I mean, most employer liability insurance excludes any sort of wage and hour.
Right.
So the common products in this area, and I'm no insurance salesman, but I can talk at least from what I've seen in terms of in terms of coverage for actual lawsuits. There are products out there in the EPL market which end up having a supplemental policy, which is generally defense only fees up to a certain cap. I've seen 150, 250. They won't contribute to settlements by and large, but they will at least defer some of the costs associated with defending the wage and hour cases. There have been a couple times where systems that have been large enough have gone out to the market and somehow gotten policies that actually go ahead and provide for both defense and indemnity up to limits. I will say that it seems rare. Yeah. And it seems, here's my plug for Lloyd's of London. It seems mostly Lloyd's driven products that are doing that.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise us. I'm sure anybody that knows that market a little bit, but your point about deferring some of the defense costs, that can be significant though.
I mean, it can certainly motivate your willingness to put in place some of the things to shrink the potential liability or payout if you end up wanting to resolve one of those cases. Because, statistical analyses, time and motion studies, which are unique to what I try to do in a lot of the QSR class actions and PAGA cases. I always want to do a time and motion study to go ahead and see the efficiency of people behind the line and the ability of within the system of these random events with customers making orders through apps, showing up in person. I want to see that there is adequate time for rest breaks and meal breaks. And that takes a time and motion study observing the cameras. Those experts are not cheap, but it's also a dual use. A lot of people have taken that, and on the operations side, they study the time use study, and they go ahead and change some operations to get some more efficiency.
Emily, any last thoughts?
I think my last thoughts are that, as Alton would agree, that plaintiffs' attorneys love wage and hour litigation because sometimes, as he said, they start off with one issue and it turns into something totally different. And it might be just a technical violation and could result in some really big judgments or very large settlements. So just being aware of the rules in your various jurisdictions, just building it into your plan, when you're sitting down and planning for the year, building that into your process to know that here's the potential liabilities and I need to make sure I'm doing the right thing, and doing so on a regular basis.
Thank you. Thank you, Emily. Thank you all. And always
Thank
a pleasure
you.
to have you guys join us, and really terrific information. Be